Are you willing to fight for that person who you don't even know as much as you're willing to fight for yourself? Are you willing to stand together and fight for those people who are struggling economically in this country? Are you willing to fight for young people drowning in student debt, even if you are not? Are you willing to fight to ensure that every American has health care as a human right, even if you have good health care? Are you willing to fight for frightened immigrant neighbors, even if you are native born? Are you willing to fight for a future for generations of people who have not yet even been born, but are entitled to live on a planet that is healthy and habitable? Because if you are willing to do that, if you are willing to love, if you are willing to fight for a government of compassion and justice and decency, if you are willing to stand up to Trump's desire to divide us up, if you are prepared to stand up to the greed and corruption of the corporate elite, if you and millions of others are prepared to do that, there is no doubt in my mind that not only will we win this election, but together we will transform this country. Thank you all very much.
Welcome back to the Millennial-Review, the podcast where we analyze the current political, cultural, and socioeconomic crises we face from the perspective of the most indebted and disenfranchised generation in history. My name's Trevor, here with a solo episode today. Before we begin, consider becoming a patron to the show at patreon.com/millennial-review. I'm really happy with the way this show is evolving right now. I think that we have unique added value in this sort of left media space as we try to theorize the post-Bernie left, which is going to be what this episode sort of tries to bring everything together that we've talked about. And obviously, one of the themes of this very project has been that a lot of people on the left are engaging in logics that are counterproductive and not helping us move forward. So if you value the work that we're doing right now, consider coming and joining us on Patreon. You get additional content and you also get to help support this project and make it sustainable going into the future. That's patreon.com/millennial-review. So I want to open this episode with a point of sort of reflection or a 30,000 foot view of our current situation, because I feel as if we've lost that. And of course, it's very easy to lose that. Politics is insane right now, and things are happening every day that just sort of rock your world. And it's just easy to get lost in the milieu of the day-to-day because the day-to-day is so crazy. One thing I'm particularly frustrated with right now in just terms of my own focus is that I feel like I haven't been spending enough time on international relations as I really like to do, just because there's just so much news happening in the United States day after day after day with this insane administration. But if we take a step back and we look at the moment from an objective point of view, what we've seen is that we're currently 8 years into a modern movement. Right? Obviously, there's been a left in the United States before, but we haven't had one in quite some time. Not an active one, right? It's like some people will try to say we are just carrying on a lineage of people 50 years ago or 100 years ago, and that just doesn't make any sense to me, right? This is not Deb's socialism. That movement is a movement that has passed and that we're now building a new one. That doesn't mean we can't draw on those traditions, of course, but to say that we can just sort of pick it right back up as if the same people are alive today, the same leaders, the same ideas, it's just not true. Right? There's no left in Russia right now, for example, and they were a fucking socialist country for a while. They can't just say, we're going to tomorrow we're going to pick up the lineage of the Russian Revolution and therefore, sort of be imbued with their powers or their organization. So what we have right now is a new left movement. And I would trace its beginning to Occupy Wall Street, right? In the organized sense. That's when this movement began. So we're 8 years in. And when you start to recognize that we're 8 years in, and our movement has basically been focused in large part on 2 presidential campaigns, obviously there's people doing work all around the country, and that's building and growing. And I think that, in even 5 years time span, we're going to be looking around and saying, wow, there's a lot more activism going on at all levels, of course. But obviously this movement has been focused on the 2 Bernie Sanders presidential campaigns. So 8 years into this movement, some people are ready to give up, unironically. And I don't mean some people online or just some random stragglers. I mean some of the biggest left institutions are ready to give up on this movement because it failed twice at 2 presidential runs, 8 years after it started. That nothing matters anymore. There's no point in engaging in the system. There apparently was 6 months ago, but now we're done with all that. Because 8 years into a movement, and for many people, they only started after Bernie ran in 2015. So for them, it's 5 years into this movement. Because we lost twice, it's time to give up. And I just think, what if history's movements had given up that quickly after 8 years? Think about this. Put that in the context. I hope just that very simple statement is clarifying to recognize that the idea of receding into pessimism right now is absurd. And a lot of the reasoning for that pessimism has been because Joe Biden has won the primary and is likely to be the next president of the United States. And nobody is denying in any sense that that's not depressing as hell, because of course it is. But I continually hear this logic, and I think that even if people don't explicitly say it this way, this is underlying a lot of the post-Bernie nihilism, is that people are just going to go to sleep under the Biden administration because they did under the Obama administration. It's always tied back to the Obama administration. And while I can't guarantee that's not going to happen, I don't see any reason to believe it will, because there literally was no left opposition to Obama in any organized sense, right? I'm sure some people listening to this might say, like, I opposed Obama, but there wasn't any coordination, right? You being an individual activist, obviously, as we know from our politics, doesn't work unless you have, strength in numbers. We are the 99%, the entire conception being a lot of people have to rise up for what they believe in. That individual activists aren't going to be able to change the world. That our work intrinsically is about convincing people and organizing them. So Obama had no left activism against him. Not in any organized sense. Not in any way that really mattered. Not in any way that was going to bring out people in the streets to protest him. They didn't build up until the end of his first term, right? There's a reason Occupy Wall Street happened in 2012 and not 2009, because the left wasn't sitting there ready to go. It was forming. That is not the case anymore. So I find it to be a bizarre proposition to say, now, after the left has built for 8 years, and has built especially over the last 5 years, that we're all just going to go back inside because Biden is the president? And again, maybe this will happen. Maybe I'm wrong, but there's no reason to believe it. Certainly not because it happened under Obama. We are just in entirely different circumstances. They're quite literally not comparable. Right? And what I say when people say this is that I have more faith in you. I have more faith in you. I have more faith in the people listening to this podcast. The defining feature of the Obama run was pure, unadulterated hope. That we finally had somebody who could be president who could actually represent a vision of a multicultural, progressive America. It was unbridled hope. I always mention his inauguration polls were stunning, where a majority of Republicans were supporting him. Nobody disapproved of him basically after he won the election. So I had a small band of explicit racists. Like, it was a tiny number across the country. The defining feature of Biden's nomination across the political left, I don't even mean the socialist left, I mean anybody who isn't either a centrist or economically comfortable, well off, or is angling to get into this administration. Aside from that, even just milquetoast progressives, Even liberals who think that we should just raise the minimum wage and have a, slightly more robust welfare state, they're not excited about Joe Biden. The defining feature of this moment is pessimism, and we have a left that is emerging and continuing to grow every day. I have more faith in you than to say that we're all going to fall asleep because now Biden is president. Obama just went on Pod Save America, and the entire purpose of him going on Pod Save America was to try to answer questions from progressives who, don't want to vote for Biden or don't have hope about a Biden administration. That's an important recognition, right? When you have a completely establishment podcast who literally worked in the Obama administration, whose entire reason for being is to sell the Democratic Party, is having Obama on in this big moment to say, what can you say to reassure people, right? And obviously they don't know what it means to actually be a progressive because they live in the DC world where the quote unquote progressives are just like very, very slightly left liberals. And so they think that they like Obama, but they're progressive. So if we just have Obama come on and reassure them, it'll work. Obviously that's nonsense, but it's really important that he was on that podcast to do that exact goal. It means the entire political establishment recognizes that this is a nominee that nobody is excited about. This is a purely anti-Trump vote. Nobody wants Biden in office. So for that to just all flip on election day and everybody's going to sort of just go home and not engage in street activism and demands because Biden's president, I don't feel that I have any reason to believe that. Okay, so that's the context of the position we're in. Just please keep in mind that we're 8 years into a movement. No transformational movement has ever succeeded this quickly and, taken over the political economy of a country and the government of a country and went on to achieve its goals. It's just not the way the world works. So please keep that context in mind when you think about our relation to the world and how we should act next. Okay, so the purpose of this podcast is going to be to try to chart a course for the post-Bernie left. What I'm trying to do, of course, I'm going to add a bunch of new stuff today too, but I'm also trying to bring together some of the last few episodes that Justin and I have done as sort of a synthesis to say, this is me staking my claim, and hopefully is representative of Justin's claim too, that this is where we're at as the left, heading into what will probably be the Biden era, heading into a moment of political flux, both across the political spectrum, right, on the far right, among liberals who really do have to make a decision if they're going to double down on corporatism or they're going to try to sell us a center-left approach to try to sort of moderate the edges, which is a very serious decision they face. And of course to the left, who is extremely divided right now and hasn't re-found its voice post-Bernie left, certainly has not been unified in any serious way. So I'm going to try to stake claim to my conception as holistically as I can give it right now for the direction we need to go. And I'm going to present it in sort of a listicle form, right? I'm going to give 10 points that I think the left needs to focus on going forward. And to me, this is a really important podcast. I'm excited to lay this all out. And if you find it useful, please consider sharing it with friends and family. Because again, I just think this is value being added that isn't being added on the left right now. I am of the belief that we are seriously finding our stride as a unique podcast in this leftist space. So if you agree, consider sharing it with family and friends. Of course, if you're not already a patron, consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/Millennial-Review. Give us a 5-star review and help us build this project. Okay, let's jump right in. Point number 1, reject pessimism. I never use the word praxis. I don't think it's a very good word. I think it's pretentious, but hope is a praxis. I'm going to continue to say that hope is something that has to be cultivated to a political end. That to be a left project, we have to be rooted in hope. We have to be. There's no other way, right? Because we want to transform the society to help all people. And the only way to do something so ambitious and so transformative is to believe that we can do it. In addition, we have obligations to one another. I have an obligation to you and the rest of society to try to build a world that I think would be better for all people. Right? It doesn't mean that I owe everybody everything, but I do owe it to humanity to do everything I can to build a world that is just and equitable for all people. That I am not separate from that person that is sleeping on the street. I just happen to be more fortunate in this period of time. I could become that person. But more importantly, I have an obligation to fight for a society that doesn't have to experience homelessness, where nobody has to experience homelessness. In the sense that these are not individual failures, these are societal failures. And therefore, I have an obligation as a member of society that wants it to be improved, that practices what I preach, to fight for our goals as aggressively as I can. And you do too. We have obligations to one another, and we need to remember that and not just say it, but actually experience it. Right? And if you have an obligation to other people, you don't get to wallow in despair, because it might make you feel better to not have to experience defeat, or to be caught up in all this nonsense, or to face the world as it is in all its brutality. I don't believe that we are afforded that luxury. We have obligations to one another. Just like if you had a family member who was experiencing something horrific, and there was even a small chance that you could do something to stop it from happening, you would feel obligated to do that. We need to extend that to the whole of society. And that doesn't mean that you're obligated to everyone all the time. It doesn't mean that, you should feel bad if you're not actively engaging in activism. Of course, all that, right? That's not what's being said here. But to recognize that we're interconnected and we have obligations to each other. And that starts with being hopeful, being optimistic, and not retreating from the world. Another point on this is it's a trope and it's kind of a boring one, but people will say, and you often hear this from liberals, so it's kind of annoying, but it is true, that even if you don't care about politics, politics cares about you. So obviously many people on the prominent left are deciding to retreat from this moment right now. Politics is still going to go on. It doesn't stop happening because you stop engaging in it. Your pessimism means that it's more likely that you're not going to have healthcare, and that nobody that you love or care about is going to have healthcare. That not only will things not get better, they're going to get worse. And one thing to note here, I will try to make this episode as Hegel-free as possible, but we need to be comfortable in contradiction. So for example, we need to balance this contradiction between being hopeful, being optimistic, and the nihilistic reality with which we find ourselves. That we should not be fully embracing one or the other, because doing so is a failure. So to say we're just one win away from achieving socialism is nonsense. To say that if another candidate runs in 2024, we just go on a general strike tomorrow, that we can win is nonsense. It's also nonsense that people have no power and there's nothing that we can do, and that, capitalism and the forces of exploitation are so strong that we could ever defeat them in any way. And, there's just no hope for anything. And you have to balance not just the contradiction in terms of, the perspective that I just gave in terms of how you view the current landscape, but also your lived experience, where Bernie Sanders was a couple Obama phone calls and 72 hours of the worst news coverage a candidate could possibly get away from potentially being the nominee right now, and about to blow Donald Trump the fuck out and be president of the United States. But now we have Joe Biden, and it's extremely depressing, and he offers us, a completely alternative reality versus what we could have had with Bernie, of course. So that's a contradiction in and of itself, how close we were. That again, Bernie, 72 hours swung this election. Absolutely, right? I don't know if he would have won for sure the other way, of course, right? But it's very, very plausible that if Obama had actually sat out this election and you hadn't seen all these people converge and do the endorsements, and the media just gave Biden fawning coverage for 72 hours consecutively, that we'd be living in a different world right now. And they seem so contradictory again, right? Like Biden versus Sanders, and the hope versus the pessimism that they instill. But we have to be comfortable with that contradiction. Another contradiction is America's promise versus its reality, right? So I don't want to put our friend and former guest Harvey K in a box, right? But Harvey K's vision is about redeeming American history and our successes of the past to try to build the current. And many people go even further than that, right? On the other side, you have this, America, right? The America with 3 Ks, that everything that America does is bad. It's pure imperialism. It's pure extraction. It's destroyed the entire planet. It's destroyed the entire world. It's the worst thing in the world. We should hate America. We should never praise it for any reason. It has no redeemable history. Everything from the day that settlers land on the coast has been nothing but blood and extraction. Those are 2 views on the left that are prominently held by prominent people. I believe that we need to handle that contradiction and embrace the contradiction. That America does have a history to draw on. That we do have Kings and Malcolms and W.E.B. Du Bois and John Brown. And, I could go on and on. This truly great history that has achieved great things. We do have the New Deal and the hope that it inspired and the way that it tried to re-envision society. And we also have the coups and domination and all the bullshit that I don't need to spend time talking about because we all know and live it every single day, right? We have to sit in that contradiction. We can't go one way or the other. We can't say that America is this great place that we just need to sort of look back to Debs and recreate what he did, but just do it a little bit better, and then we'll have this utopian socialism. But it's also just silly, counterproductive, and not convincing anybody to just completely flatten the distinctions of American history and say that it's just irredeemable, right? If it's irredeemable, then what are we doing here, right? If America can never do good, then our project is moot. Okay, so that's point number 1, reject pessimism. Point number 2 is organize, organize, organize. And an important note I want to make here is not just in pure labor terms, right? So a lot of lefties are obsessed with organizing labor. And of course, that's extremely important. Unions, strikes, all of that, of course. But life isn't just about labor, right? I think that the socialist left understands that in terms of many of us, sort of found our way to the left or got more deeply entrenched into our leftism because we realized that the idea that all we should do is work, and that's the only thing that our life is worth. The only value that we have is work. But then at the same time, we become obsessed with the fact that life is about work, and that our only source of power is through labor, and therefore, we need to focus purely on the workplace. I think that's wrong, and it's not something that I subscribe to. Of course, labor organizing is important. Of course, it is a major source of power, but it's not the end-all, be-all of organization, and it's not the end-all, be-all of socialism. So, to further elaborate that point, we need to reject the separation between the base and the superstructure. This is an idea that comes out of Marx, where he defines the base as the means and relations of production, right? So this is who produces what, who owns what, and, your role as a worker, how you sell your labor, the kind of wages that you can demand. That's all part of the base. And a lot of leftists think that the base is the only thing that we should care about. But Marx also defined the superstructure as laying on top of the base. And it's about law and culture and politics and religion and relationships and family and media. And what a lot of Marxists say when they talk about base versus superstructure is that the superstructure simply reinforces the base. That the only good of these institutions is to maintain the current relationships we have at the workplace, right? That media can only be a tool of capitalists to reinforce the idea that you should sell your labor to a capitalist. That churches, the opiate of the masses, the idea that religion is just another tool of oppression that keeps us from uprising and instituting socialism. That education, right, is in a superstructure. Education is constructed to make sure that we're just training little workers. That even family, right? Family has been defined in a heteronormative structure, and all that does is to reinforce capitalism. Now, obviously, that was a steel man of the argument, so many of you are probably nodding in agreement with some of the things that I just said. And of course, these things hold serious truths, right? There's no doubt about that. But, just as we want to recreate, reimagine, reconstruct the base relationship, where we want workers to own the means of production, we too want to reform, reconstruct, and reimagine the superstructure. The idea that we can use the tools of our labor to change the relationship in the base, but we can't do the same in the superstructure is nonsense. And it's also true that it doesn't always work in one direction. We can take some very simple examples in terms of liberation theology or alternative media like the podcast you're listening to right now. I think something like The Majority Report is a great example of a show that sort of takes the structure of a mainstream news network, has huge viewership and is a daily news show, but absolutely does not reinforce the kind of things that corporate media does. Or, to complexify things, think about the end of slavery and how it came about. It happened because of Christian ethics, that people were directly reading their Bible, reading Bible verses, showing the hypocrisy of slavery, and they used their faith, certainly in the case of John Brown, to will themselves to this righteous fight. But what also reinforced slavery in the first place? It was Christianity as well, which shows you that the idea that these things only work in one direction, that the superstructure is extractive of the base, that all that stuff about media and ideas and philosophy and law and money, all that shit is just extracting. It's just in opposition to the base. It's just reinforcing our oppression. That's nonsense. Not only do I think the superstructure is perfectly important in what we actually want to do, equally important, there's actually no distinction between the base and the superstructure. They're not in conflict. They're one and the same. Separating them is a silly thing to do, right? So think about Justin studying law. Justin isn't studying law because he says, okay, this is an institution that is extractive of the working class, and I'm going to join it anyways. No, Justin is rejecting that very premise and actively trying to reimagine the law so it can be used to good ends, which of course it can. 100%. The idea that law is only used to ruin people's lives is ridiculous. And again, this is about embracing contradiction. Right? Justin's career path is embracing contradiction, recognizing that this institution is broken. It's absolutely used to protect the powerful against the powerless, but that it can absolutely be used in the opposite direction it needs to be. And then, in fact, that's one of the most powerful tools we have. That you can make gains through legal systems that you are going to really struggle to make in terms of convincing a bunch of workers to rise up and form worker co-ops. But again, these things aren't even separate in the first place. Law creates labor conditions, and labor conditions create law. And so, further developing this point, intersectionality and solidarity aren't just buzzwords or even ideas. They're necessities. They're the lived reality of the world, right? And I want to make a very clear distinction here. A lot of lefties just reject movements like Black Lives Matter out of hand because they're silly identity issues, right? We're focusing on Black Lives Matter or trans issues or feminism. This is all just a distraction from, the workplace. That's a serious take on the hard materialist left right now. But, the more common position against people who are identity skeptical, but recognize that, it's not all about class relations, will say what we need to do is take these movements and these protests, and we need to win these identity people over to class. We need to convince them that your oppression by the police or your oppression by patriarchy is actually created by capitalism, reinforced by capitalism. And so, yes, I agree that Black Lives matter. And the reason why Black lives don't matter in the society right now is because of capitalism. But I don't think this is the right approach. It's not just about telling people that care about identity that class is actually underlying their issues with identity. It's much deeper than that. We're trying to construct a world in which identity is mediated in certain ways, right? So in the same way in our current society, Black is coded as criminal, or, women is coded as weak. We want to use the same tools of mediation to recode people as deserving and smart and culturally significant. This runs much deeper than how much surplus value your boss is stealing from you at work. And I believe this is what socialism means. I should circle back. When I keep saying mediating or mediation, what I mean is using tools like law, money, art, literature, media, philosophy, right? These are the institutions in our society that determine how society functions, right? So it's not a mistake that Black people get coded as criminal. That's not some natural outgrowth of the world. That was cultivated through mediation. That was cultivated through TV shows like Cops. That was cultivated through racist depictions in newspapers. That was cultivated through art that was extremely racist at the turn of the century, right? All kinds of social institutions then construct and reify how we see certain groups of people. That's the way the world actually functions, right? And so to reject this concept entirely, which is what only focusing on the base does, which says literally that all this stuff is just a distraction, media and culture and all that nonsense, these high-level ideas, philosophy, that's all just a distraction from what really matters, is to cede this mediation to capitalists, essentially. It's to give up from the start. Because people getting higher wages or taking over the means of their production even is not going to change the way society sees them inherently, and is not going to create social relationships between people that eliminates things like racism and sexism, or at least goes as far as we possibly can. That's not happening without caring about the superstructure and not seeing class relations as separate from family and media and religion and the kind of isms and phobias that these things create. Again, as I continue to repeat, socialism is a process, not an outcome. It's not the end goal of an equation after the equal sign. Then you get socialism. It's a process. And this process is about more than just capital. It's about social relations. Media, art, feminism, black equality, communications, relations. This is socialism. It's not just about how much you make it work. It's not just about your paycheck. Okay, quickly recap. Number 1, reject pessimism. Number 2, organize, but not in pure labor terms. Number 3, reject scarcity and all the logics that underlie it. So this is a rejection of the neoclassical conception and sort of the Econ 101 dogma. I always find it very funny that every leftist in the world will tell you that like neoclassical economics that you learn in school is nonsense. And of course it is. But many of them accept the day one lesson. Day one, when you walk into an economics classroom, the first lesson is that the world is scarce. There are scarce resources, and economics is about how we divide up the pie, basically. And many leftists buy into this. And what I want to say is that resources aren't a thing. They're a constant social production and reproduction. And there is no separation between man and nature. We are part of nature. And we're not constrained by a fixed set of resources with a limited value. That's just empirically not how the world works. As I continue to point out, all of our resource mixes were a choice, and they continue to be a choice that's made every single day, right? We have been propping up the fossil fuel industry for decades now. It gets massive subsidies every year. We're at a point where solar is cheaper than fossil fuels. It literally costs firms less money to produce with solar, but they're still getting propped up by billions and billions and billions of dollars in subsidies. So they're going to continue to choose that choice because it's cheaper than them with the subsidy. This is a choice that we're making. We never had to burn coal. Burning coal was a choice. And we can make different choices. Resources are not, they become, right? Would coal have been a resource if we never burned it? No, we wouldn't even consider it a resource. The way we don't consider many things resources today because we happen to not use them. That's because resources are a creation, right? And so we can't build a left that's focused on scarcity. We can't build a left that engages in zero-sum logics, that for me to be better off, you have to be worse off. We can't view the world through trade-offs, right? And we can't win by trying to set an optimal tax rate at which rich people give us, quote unquote, their money. And here's the big problem here. If you start with scarcity, some people will be left out by definition. Immigrants, trans folks, disabled people. And that's not socialism. I think this is very, very, very important to reaffirm. A society that leaves out anyone is not socialism. A society built on exclusion of any form is not socialism. So I think, for example, most people have written off Crystal Ball as like this leftist at this point in time. Most of the Rising show now is just like literally some of the worst both sidesing you've ever heard. It sure seems to me to be scripted to be that way. So for example, in an episode just a couple days ago, Crystal Ball said that she's equally worried about Democrat and Republican violence after the election, which is obviously just pure horse shit. But back when there was a debate over Rising and Crystal Ball and the purpose of the show that Justin and I would have quite often, people would always come to us and say, like, why don't you, like, Crystal Ball clearly believes in progressive ideas and she's on, this primetime TV show. What is the problem with it? And this is the problem with it. Assume that Crystal Ball was a perfectly well-intentioned socialist who wanted to see this equitable society where workers own the means of production. She has decided that the best way to push that, or a way to push that even, a plausible path, is to team up with the right, that right-wing populist and left-wing populist. Bernie Sanders and Josh Hawley need to be able to team up and work together towards a common vision and make trade-offs between each other. We have to give concessions to them so that we can see the world that we want to see. What that is a complete embrace of scarcity and exclusion. And socialism built on exclusion is not socialism at all, and it will not win. The idea that we can reject immigrants and reject the concerns of trans people and all this identity nonsense and be an inclusive movement that is successful is nonsense. The right-wing populist, quote unquote, will always win in that scenario 100% of the time. Because anybody who is on board with exclusion is gonna want more of it. And the final point here is to not tie ourselves to rich people's money. The Bulgarian economist Pavlina Cherneva writes, "Tax the rich to pay for progress leftism is an imaginary umbilical cord that tethers us to our oppressors." We do not need Jeff Bezos' money. We don't need it. That's not how money works. So we can't say we have scarce resources and we're trying to get their money and give it to our people, right? Money is public. It's always our money. It's created by our government, and we are supposed to live in a democracy, and we certainly want to build a democratic future. So reifying the idea that rich people have money and we need to take it from them and give to us is wrong, and it will be a failure. We cannot tax our way to socialism. Okay, point number 4 is to reject the state of nature. This is another sort of logical foundation that if we don't reject it, I think leads to really bad places, the same as scarcity, right? So the state of nature, pushed by Adam Smith and John Locke and Thomas Hobbes and Marx fully embraces this state of nature idea. And this idea starts with Robinson Crusoe, who is stranded on an island and he needs to, sort of engage with the resources at hand and be able to survive, right? So it's just this individual in a pure state of nature. How do they act? And again, Marx takes this and, runs with it in Capital and tries to construct a logical system about what it means to be in a state of nature and to leave the state of nature. And this is just flat out wrong. It's also antithetical to our worldview. So what we want to instead put in the place of the idea of the state of nature is the exact opposite. That when we are born into social relations that are already mediated. And so, you can imagine how expansive this reality is in terms of all the different social relations that exist that we are born into. But to just break this down very simply, think about a situation of a child being born to parents who are abusive in some way. Let's say the father is an alcoholic and the parents are always fighting. This is a result of the social relations that they have already been exposed to, right? Alcoholism isn't an individual failure. It's the result of society. So, for example, there's this famous study about rats and our understanding of drug addiction. So for years, researchers have studied rats and drug addiction in terms of you give them, like the feeders, one has water or food come out and the other has like cocaine come out. And the question is, how will the rat react? And what we've found for years is that, our very standard theory of drugs, that you take it once, you like it, you keep taking it, pretty soon you're addicted. Well, what researchers finally said somehow after decades is, hey, wait a second. We have this rat sitting in a cage by itself. It doesn't get exercise. It has no room to run around. It has no social interactions with anybody else. Maybe the reason why it's getting addicted to the drugs is because it's bored. There's nothing else for it to do. And so what they found was when they put the rat in rat paradise, where There was space, there was toys, there was other things to do, there was another rat to fuck. What they found is the addiction problem entirely went away. In fact, how the rats acted was as a recreational user. That every few days they would use the cocaine for fun, but they wouldn't come back to keep getting it. Because they were in social relations in which they were happy. In which they had their needs met, right? Obviously it doesn't take a lot to make a rat happy. It's more complicated for us. But this is the point. That when you're born to those parents, they already had social relations that impacted them, and you're born right into that. You experience that from day one, right? Children take in so much in the first year of their life when to us it seems like babies are just, sort of clueless, but they're taking in everything, right? The most important neurons ever formed are in the first 2 years. Most of who you become is built in those first 2 years. So I say this to say that we tend to sort of reify the Robinson Crusoe story of man in the state of nature who then leaves it to also apply to individuals. This is a famous economics tale. This is how Marx talks about it. That you start not already engaged in society, that you leave your individual identity to go be part of society. And that has implications. The idea that you could ever be separate from society has big implications. I'm going to bring in Hegel for the last time, I swear. What Hegel says is that I don't form my identity of myself without being in relation to the other. That in fact, I can only define myself as what I'm not, right? There's no way to define the individual without relation to the other, without having some referent around you to differentiate yourself. I think that's fundamentally true. If you think about how you formed your own identity, I think that you will find this to be true, right? So this matters. This really matters. Because if you think about appealing to mass politics, it matters if you think that your goal as a socialist has to be pulling all these individuals into a kind of social contract, or if they're already born into social relations, and therefore we need to figure out how to take care of everybody best in relation to everybody else. This distinction is critical. It's important. It's important for policymaking. It's important for foundational ideas about how society functions. It's important for a propaganda or a convincing strategy, right? Because if it is the case that there are a bunch of Robinson Crusoes, that we are born into the world as separate entities, and then we sort of decide how we're going to interact with it, then we do have to appeal to enlightened self-interest. We do have to make sure that everybody is, benefiting themselves from socialism. Fortunately, that's not the case. That's a myth. It's not true. And it's important to know that there is no social contract. The idea is that the social contract sort of creates relations, that I decide to enter society. I decide to contract with the rest of you, and then we come into relationship through this contract we all signed. That's wrong, right? That is wrong. We are embedded as a social species. So one very simple example of how I think this can play out is the idea of prisons. If you reject the idea of Hegel that we define ourselves in difference to other people, if you reject the idea that we're born into already mediated social relationships, then it makes perfect sense to think that this individual who committed a crime should have to go to jail. They violated their social contract, right? They weren't embedded in a social institution under which they had no control because they were born or thrown into it. They decided to be this way. So we need to punish them. And I want to say when we reject this vision, we can use mediation tools like the law, which creates prisons. We can design the law. We can design the provisioning of money. We can design education and family and religion to be a different way through institutions once we recognize our interconnectedness as a species. And we can't just reject these things out of hand as superstructure because they're currently bad, because they currently suck. Because the law currently isn't used in the right way. Education is, in a lot of ways, used to indoctrinate children. They can be flipped from protecting the powerful to protecting the powerless. So we need to recognize relationality at all levels, right? This has deeper implications too, I think, for how we see our obligation to one another. We're all in relation. Drug addiction is a societal failure, as is too big to fail. In other words, allowing somebody to fall into drug addiction because their social circumstances were awful and it was the only way they found escape is on society and our failures the same way as these banks that got so big they could just crash the entire global economy, at the snap of a finger, is also societal failure. And one final thing to say, sort of going back to the state of nature concept, is that in some ways we've created our own left state of nature, right? So there's one side of this that says that we're all just individuals born into the world who then decide to interact with it. The other one says that we're just this undifferentiated mass, right? That workers are just born into pure exploitation. That's all capitalism is or ever can be. And so therefore they all sort of have this innate knowledge of how exploited they are. And so any appeals to their race or their gender, any of this nonsense, right? We should just focus on them being exploited in the workplace, because we're all aware of that, that this is the natural state, and we have to appeal to workers' natural base instincts. Which leads me into point number 5, don't naturalize nor deify our current world, right? So there's two implicit currents on the left. Either exploitation and extraction and conflict are the only way the world functions or can ever function, or these systems were created, but now they're so powerful and all-encompassing that they're essentially a deity. They're godlike. They're untouchable. So what we need to say is that there's no teleology. There's no way the world had to be that was predetermined. And our current systems are not predetermined. The world is a construction, and it was theorized before it was created. Nothing natural about markets or neoliberalism. These were constructions, right? The world is in motion, and this motion is constantly being produced and reproduced, and it will never stop, right? So our job is to reimagine the world such that it allows us to construct a better one. Another point here that I'm always frustrated with, and I think that we need to get past, is seeing the threat of fascism as a thing as opposed to a process, as something that arrives, right? Fascism is a verb. It's something that happens, right? So we can see, in the police, in ICE, in these rhetorics of exclusion, how fascism is being enacted as a verb. Yesterday in Georgia, Trump said, lock up the Bidens, lock up Hillary, lock them up. So the debate shouldn't be whether Trump is a fascist after he said that. It should be on his fascist rhetoric and the implications that has, right? And it's also influencing millions and millions of people, right? And also, maybe he's not going to actually lock up Joe Biden and Hillary Clinton, right? But that's not what's important. He's informing people that it's okay to want to jail your political opponents. And also, his attorney general is now locking up people without legal recompense. They just murdered a supposed Antifa activist in cold blood without warning. And the president defended it at a rally on national TV, right? This is fascism. It's not a thing. It's an ongoing process. And in this vein, we need to deal with the world and our position in it as the left, as it is, so we can make it what we want it to be. We don't need to spin fantasies. We don't need to make things better nor worse than they actually are. We need to analyze the world on its own terms. That's the only way to victory. It's the only hope we actually have. And let me tell you about what I think is a divergence from this, and that's the TrueAnon podcast. Right? So the whole point of the TrueAnon podcast is that it's like QAnon, but true. And that's not just purely tongue-in-cheek. That's really like the basis of the show. That there actually is, like this global pedophile cabal. It's just not who QAnon says it is, right? And it's all about Jeffrey Epstein. Now, Jeffrey Epstein is this unique nexus point of sort of all the embedded evil of American politics. And I think that this is a really good way to talk about not dealing with the world as it is, right? So who is Jeffrey Epstein? Jeffrey Epstein is a horrific human being who figured out how to make a shit ton of money in our financial system, because there's a bunch of ways to make a shit ton of money in our financial system. And if you're a ghoul committed enough and, you start with a few connections, you can do just that, right? So he decided to engage in massive extraction, engage in Wall Street speculating, and he made a shit ton of money from it. And because this is how the world of elite capital works, he was basically able to position himself as a go-between between a bunch of different financial interests, right? And he was a pedophile, and he had a bunch of rich and powerful people go to his island, some of which clearly were going there for quote-unquote regular purposes. Some of those who were clearly going there to have weird but consensual adult sex, and then some of them who were going there to have sex with children. That's who Jeffrey Epstein is, right? Horrible, horrible person. And he exposed the fact that there are also several other horrible, horrible people in our ruling class who like to have sex with children. That's what Jeffrey Epstein is. And of course, he died in a mysterious way. And I'm willing to fully accept the conspiracy that one of those powerful people with whom he engaged in pedophilia with had him killed, right? Let's accept that it's true. That's one thing. It tells us a fair amount about how our working class operates. It tells us about how our financial system operates. It tells us about how these connections are made. It doesn't tell us about the underlying workings of capitalism, which is essentially the premise of the True Anon podcast. It doesn't unlock the keys to just, if we just figure out who was on that island, we'll suddenly, I don't know, understand how capital works and then somehow be able to defeat it. That the secret of our system of political economy, of trillions and trillions of dollars worth of GDP every single year can be understood by knowing who went to Jeffrey Epstein's island and what they were doing. And, one way I think, I just find the Jeffrey Epstein thing to be bizarre with how much people think that it's like this black box that's going to unlock the secrets of the world to us, going to unlock how our ruling class works. When in reality, if we knew everything about the Jeffrey Epstein case, we would probably know that there's like 40 people who are pedophiles, and many of them are influential and important members in our society. Important thing to know. I wish we did. It would tell us something, but it's not going to unlock the keys. Don't forget, we had Dennis Hastert, who was the Speaker of the House for decades, who was a pedophile of one of the most prolific kinds ever. Speaker of the House. There's no conspiracy theories about Dennis Hastert because people recognize that he's a disgusting human being who did some really freaky shit, and there were probably people in the elite class that were involved with him too. That's probably safe to assume. But we don't generate the idea that like we can unlock the secrets by figuring out what Dennis Hastert did. And the reason I say all this is because I really feel like we are both naturalizing and deifying the system through these modes of thought. We're both saying this is how power operates, and it's diffuse, it's buried behind conspiracy theories. There's nothing that we can do to stop it, but also giving it like these mystical powers, like Jeffrey Epstein was this great purveyor of global capitalism, as opposed to a guy with tens of millions of dollars who was a sex freak. Okay, on that light note, number 6, we need to be based in 3 policy proposals: the jobs guarantee, Medicare for all, and the Green New Deal. Should be a 3-pronged approach. And what these policies push is radical inclusion in the deepest sense of the word. No one is left out because they don't have to be. The jobs guarantee literally says no one should be unemployed. We should have 0 people unemployed. And if they are unemployed, they can go work for the jobs guarantee program. They can go work for the federal government. And again, doing things that we think are valuable to society. And it's important to note that none of these things are purely economic or base. This isn't just about production. This is about social production and social relations, not just about economic ones, right? The jobs guarantee is about rectifying inequalities as well as providing explicit values to certain things our society doesn't currently value, right? Arts, writing, reading, cooking, in addition to some of our current jobs that we only use for things that can immediately gain monetary value, right? So things like welding, construction, carpentry, building public spaces and public monuments that define equitable social relations, because symbolism matters and isn't just some abstract bullshit. It helps determine how we relate with each other and what we value in the aesthetic, the social, and the transcendent sense, as opposed to just the value of profit. Medicare for all is not just about getting everyone healthcare when they get sick. It's about reimagining what it means for society to be healthy and allowing both patients and the broader public as sort of a social unit to provision healthcare in the way they want it provisioned. The Green New Deal is reimagining what it means to be a demos, re-envisioning our relationship with nature as one that is inclusive and connected rather than exclusive and extractive. In addition, we should also, and many old school and some new school Marxists hate this, consistently use the language of rights. You have a right to housing. You have a right to healthcare. You have a right to education. You have a right to jobs as a human being. These aren't just policies, they are transformations. And they go beyond your pocketbook to what actually makes life worth living. Number 7, redefine power and social relations from the bottom up, but also horizontally. So what I mean by bottom up is that we need to not just recreate hierarchies that are more equitable, but actually build power and relations that are embedded within social structures of the mass of the population. Small d democracy in the truest sense of the term. And what that means is not just saying, we have a benevolent dictator who is going to do the things that we want it to do, but to say that actually, because socialism is a process and not an outcome, even if we had sort of the perfect king to do things for us, that's not the society we're trying to create. We need input from everybody. Radical inclusion. But when I say horizontally, I mean that we need to understand our Foucault in telling us that power is much more diffuse than just looking at hierarchies. That power is recreated at the horizontal level, right? So if we think about a poor minority individual engaging in transphobia, right? This is the type of power that we need to examine that doesn't really make sense if you just think from a pure hierarchical place, right? Because the hierarchy isn't clear there. But all that is a failure to imagination how power actually works. It's a way too vulgar sense of thinking of power as just top down, when in reality, it's reproduced horizontally. And it's diffuse. And once we recognize how power actually functions in this sense, we can work on actual solutions that don't just try to simplify the issue and make sure, that nobody has more money than somebody else. That's not the only way that power exerts itself. It's also important to notice the legacy of these things, so that if we push for a society in which there's no clear hierarchy between trans people and anybody else, but there is this sort of horizontal power exertion from otherizing trans people, we have to recognize that trans people are going to internalize these things, and that has implications too. Right? So we need a more robust understanding of power that isn't simplified between I'm your boss at work and you're my worker, and therefore I have power over you. Number 8, try everything all at once. Freedom is a constant struggle and takes place in every domain. So there is no action too big or too small if you're mindfully trying to create a better world. I think that you know what I mean by no action too small, but also no action too big. So trying to win a presidential race isn't too big. Trying to, engage in radical reforms isn't too big. Trying to go to your state house and making a legislature, change their mind isn't too big, even if that seems like a just completely daunting task and seems like it's too high level. Seems like there's too much power and money involved that you could never have any influence in this. Trying to stop Amy Coney Barrett from being on the Supreme Court, even though we know that it's nearly inevitable, right? There's no battle too small or too big to fight. And this includes things that aren't nakedly political, right? Create friendships. Donate to local mayoral races, join strikes, push for unions, create student groups, make sure politicians that we support and care about know that we care about them and want to protect them and keep them in office. Create art, start book clubs. I'm no Gandhi fan, but the idea of creating the world you want to see, as long as it's not used to be like a Jordan Peterson-esque, get your own house in order before you try to change the world, but rather in the sense that before you get to a place of power where you can have serious chances at change, if you're doing your part to change social relations such that people are more prepared for that change, you should engage in doing so. Number 9, we are creating a new world, not just reshuffling the old world. This one, to me, is extremely important. So we need to be rooted in history. As people who have listened to this podcast for a long time will know, I always say that my favorite thing about the left is how historical we are, how historically grounded we are. The left has always understood the role of historical analysis, but we also can't be wedded to it. We're not trying to recreate something that happened in the past. We're not trying to recreate the Russian Revolution. We're not trying to recreate the Cuban Revolution. We're not trying to recreate the Nordic model. And we're certainly not trying to use our current structures of production to just take that money that's built off exploitation and just give more of it back to the working class. That's a lack of imagination. That's reshuffling the old world. We want to create the world anew. We want to create new forms of social organization using tools of mediation, which I've been discussing, law, money, media, philosophy, culture. And through those tools of mediation, creating new possibilities and destroying old ones in the process. This is the abolition framework I discussed, abolishing the logics of the old world and reconstructing the new world. Recognizing that we cannot escape the past, nor should we want to, but we're using the tools that it has bestowed upon us, whether those just be actual ideas or, physical manifestations of institutions like global institutions or universities, to generate new modes of social relations. Okay, number 10, my final point is going to be an adaptation of a thing that Michael Brooks said before he passed, which was be kind with people, but be ruthless with institutions. And obviously Michael was right about that in terms of we need to extend good faith to people, be kind to people, and again, sort of create the world that we want to see by living it through our own life before we're actually able to change institutions, which in this context just means building social networks of people that rely on you and that you can rely on. But also, first of all, never lose your sense of outrage at the world, at the way the world functions, at the institutions that currently exist. Never accept them as is, and also work effortlessly to overtake them and use them to our own ends. That's how we should treat institutions. But I want to alter Michael's statement slightly to say, be kind with people, but be ruthless with ideas. So again, create the kind of attitudes and relations that you want to see with those in your life. Act in good faith towards as many people as possible, but also reject bad ideas aggressively, even if they take the form of being on quote unquote the left. Bad ideas like nihilism, like scarcity, like exclusion, like the idea that the only thing that matters to people is their position in the workplace. The entire idea of the right is that we need to exclude huge swaths of the population. And that has an appealing logic to a certain subset of people that's bigger than we would like it to be. We will lose if we embrace the ideas of scarcity, but just say we want to exclude less people. Be kind with people, be ruthless with ideas. Okay, so I want to end the podcast today by reading one quote from Martin Luther King, which has always been my favorite, and then one quote from Corey Robin, and then I will reread my list, and then I will get out of here and go walk my poor dogs. Okay, so first with MLK. One of the greatest problems of history is that the concepts of love and power are usually contrasted as polar opposites. Love is identified with a resignation of power, and power with a denial of love. What is needed is a realization that power without love is reckless and abusive, and that love without power is sentimental and anemic. Power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice. Justice at its best is love correcting everything that stands against justice. And now this quote from Corey Robin, one of my favorite left theorists, about this idea of contradiction and what it means to be a socialist. Robin writes, "Socialism is about converting hysterical misery into ordinary unhappiness. Socialism won't eliminate the sorrows of the human condition. Loss, death, betrayal, disappointment, hurt, none of these would disappear or even be mitigated in a socialist society. Against your will you enter this world, against your will you will leave it. That's not going to change under socialism. But what socialism can do is to arrange things so that you can actually deal with and confront these unhappinesses of the human condition. Socialism is not a flight from the human condition, it's a direct and unsentimental confrontation with that condition." Okay, and finally, I will reread my list of the things that I think the left needs to do to go beyond Bernie. 1. Reject pessimism. 2, organize, 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 and not just in labor terms. 3, reject scarcity and all the logics that underlie it. 4, reject the state of nature. 5, don't naturalize nor deify our current world. 6, be rooted in 3 core policy proposals: a jobs guarantee, Medicare for all, and the Green New Deal. 7, redefine power and social relations from the bottom up, but also horizontally. 8, try everything and all at once. 9, we are creating a new world, not reshuffling the old world. 10, be kind with people, be ruthless with ideas. I'll talk to you next time. Bye.